So the approach that we've used in this meditation and the previous one, looking for the person, is using the method of investigating in terms of if the me exists from its own side, if it's there must be findable, and if the me is findable, it must either be the same as the body and the mind or different than the body and the mind. So the reasoning is called same or different. And the only place that it could possibly be would be the same as the body and the mind. Because if me is different than the body and the mind, it would mean that we must be able to have an experience of me somewhere over there. Something different than the body and the mind. And we only have a sense of me in conjunction with some aspect of the body and the mind. But to be complete, we can look in both situations, same and different. And so what we did in that meditation is, if the me is the same as the body and the mind, you must be able to find it somewhere in the body and the mind. So you search through the body, you search through the mind, and if you don't find it in either of those two places, then the only place it could be is something different than the body and the mind, which means you must be able to take away the body and the mind and be left with the me. And if we can't have that, if we don't see that, then that findable me can't exist. And once we do that search and we don't find, then we simply rest in the experience of not finding. That experience is an experience of emptiness. Now, a couple of places where we often go astray in this practice. One I mentioned already is that we often turn this emptiness meditation into an intellectual exercise. And then, of course, our intellectual mind always comes up with an answer, because based on our study or understanding or belief system, we tend to have an idea or a belief of who we really think we are. So then if we start to do this search, often what happens is our intellectual mind comes in and goes, I know the answer. And often if we've studied something in Buddhism, the intellectual mind says, I'm the subtle mental continuum, because that's what goes from life to life. Or if we've studied some more New Age, modern theories, where they talk about often everything in the universe is subtle energy, subtle vibration, then the intellectual mind will come in and goes, I know, I'm just subtle vibration. But I can guarantee that when we get angry, we're not identifying with subtle mental continuum or subtle vibration as the me who's getting angry. No? I don't think so. So, therefore, we need to give the intellectual mind a holiday, and we just look directly for the me. Now, as a beginner, often when we sit down to meditate and we relax the body and we relax the mind, then our normal strong sense of me often calms down. We don't have a clear target to look for. So that's why in this meditation, I said at the beginning, think of a situation where someone's praising you for something. Usually if someone's praising us, we have a really strong sense, oh, I'm being praised. Or if someone's criticizing us, I'm being criticized. And we have a very clear, strong sense of me in that occasion. That's the me we're relating to. That's the me we need to look for. And then we search. And the other place, often where, of course, we go wrong, is that our mind is not very clear and focused. And so then we don't do the search in a very clear, methodical way. We sort of go a bit here, a bit there, and then we just get confused and not sure if we looked everywhere or not. So again, to help overcome that, the shamatha practice is very helpful, very important. If we can really develop a very calm, clear, focused mind, I think you'll find this investigation, this search will work a lot better. The third place where often we go astray, and actually this is a good sign, actually, this one, it's just a misinterpretation, is that often what happens is we do the search and then at some point a lot of fear arises in the search. If you're having fear coming up in the search, usually it's a very good sign. It usually means we're searching well and we're really coming to the point where we don't seem to really able to find the me. And what's happening is that we're misinterpreting that not finding experience. We're misinterpreting it as there's no me at all, or it seems like we're going out of existence. And so this fear is completely irrational, because if you don't exist, there can be no fear. So the fact that fear is arising is proof that you exist. And what's really happening is we are simply misinterpreting this experience. And the reason we misinterpret this experience is we are stuck in what's called the two extremes. The two extremes are existence and non-existence. And by existence I mean independent existence. So generally this is where we are now. We grasp onto and believe everything exists independently. And so of course in this meditation we're looking for the independent me that seems to be here somewhere. And if we're searching, 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 we don't seem to find it. We're undermining the fact that I exist independently. The only me that we've identified with in our entire life is this supposed independent me. So for us now there's only two possibilities. Either there is this independent me here or there's no me at all. We don't see any other possibility. So once we start to undermine this independent me in meditation by looking in a very clear, methodical way, don't seem to find it, that not finding experience, which is an experience of emptiness actually, we misinterpret to mean there's no me at all. And so what we tend to do is we flip to the other extreme of non-existence, of nihilism, thinking nothing exists. So again, to help overcome that fear, two things. One, of course, is simply ask the question, who's having the fear? Because if you don't exist, there can be no fear. So the fact that you're experiencing fear proves you exist. And the other thing that's going to be helpful is to understand that we are simply realizing we do not exist independently. We're not realizing we don't exist. We're simply realizing we do not exist independently. And thereby, if we can realize that, we can find the middle way between these two extremes. So to help us to overcome the extreme of nihilism, we need to understand the flip side of emptiness, because emptiness is the fact that nothing exists independently. So the flip side of that, of course, is things exist dependently. So that's what we're going to have a look at now. How is it then that things exist dependently? But before we do that, is there any questions about this meditation? Anything not clear?
I have a question about this. Actually, I'm experiencing this in episodes for years.
Fear.
For years.
Yeah.
I have like late at night in bed, it comes spontaneously before I practice meditation. That's actually the reason I started practicing meditation. And I go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And the anxiety is like up to the roof.
Right, exactly.
And then I have two questions.
Yeah, sure.
One, you say that I tried doing the if I don't exist, who is here fearing?
Yeah.
The reason I give myself that keeps the anxiety up the roof is that like there is the mind, and the mind is like a program or a software that's the one fearing, but that's not me. Like my name is Inbal, that's not Inbal. There is no Inbal, and then I'm at the nihilist stage,
Yeah.
and the anxiety won't go away.
Exactly. So therefore, we need to appreciate what I'm going to talk about now in this session. This idea of things existing dependently. Because emptiness is the antidote to this extreme, and the antidote to this extreme is what's called dependent arising. And so that's what we're going to look at now. So that's coming up.
The arrow midpoint between number one and number two, that's the Buddha's middle way? That's the middle
Yeah,
way.
that's the middle way, yes.
Trying to meditate now in like a beginner's way, what I did find is I found a self, me, not in the body. In the mind it's more complicated because we don't find the mind, but there was a sort of light contraction in the chest, which I felt as energy, but not a nice energy. I mean, contracted energy. And then I asked myself, then I started thinking, and I said, why in this meditation we ignore what we call the subtle body, not in the new age way, but it's an energy. Maybe it's that. For many years I didn't find myself, but I did find something.
Right. So
And
you...
then-
go on.
And then it stayed there for some time,
Sure.
and then it disappeared.
Right. Okay, so now the question...
Then I asked myself, okay, it's not there. If it
Right.
was there, I could find it all the time.
So
But
the-
still, what was it?
So the interesting question now is, you said you experienced a contraction in the chest.
I felt it was in the chest, but not physically.
No,
It's
but
not in the ribs or
you
in
felt
the
something.
heart or-
You felt some contraction. You said, or something. Or what did you say?
Like a contraction. I mean, it was.
Right. So
like
the
an
question
energy.
is, you felt contraction. Who's the you that felt the contraction? That's the question. Because contraction is something you're experiencing. So by definition, if you're experiencing it, it's not you. It's something you're experiencing. So then if you have that feeling of contraction, then ask the question, who's experiencing that?
Like-
That's the question.
Like when you ask who is practicing,
Sure.
then I got lost.
Sure.
I didn't find
But
it.
again, what we need to get is the intellectual mind. We need to throw it out, because it's our intellectual mind that actually is the creation of our problem. And I think, as Einstein said, you can't solve a problem at the level you created it at, which means you will never work it out with your intellectual mind, because it's the intellectual mind that created the problem in the first place. So we need to go beyond that. If we're stuck in the intellectual mind, we'll go round and round and round and round and round for the rest of our life and not get anywhere. So throw out the intellectual mind and look directly.
What's wrong with the thought? Me and
I can't hear you, sorry.
what's wrong with the thought? Me and my mind are one. Then
Right.
I feel like
Okay.
there is something.
Do you have a mind? Do you have a mind? If you have a mind, you can't be the mind. You can't have something and be it. So there's your proof. Easy. No? You can't have something and be it. It's not possible. And so what happens, of course, is, as I mentioned before, often people who come into Buddhism, they often come up with this answer, because the intellectual mind says, well, it's the mind that goes from life to life, so that's the real me, I'm my mind. But we didn't look. We just let our intellectual mind try and figure it out. And then, of course, we go round and round and round and round and not get anywhere. So throw it out and just look. And we're going to, tomorrow morning, today we've looked at person, and the next session we're going to look at the body. Can you find a body here? And then tomorrow morning we're going to look for the mind. See if you can find the mind. Right. So let's have a look at this idea of
the fact that things are dependent and how that's going to help us to overcome this extreme. And so that's the next of the fourfold profundity. And that's the next statement in the Heart Sutra that says, emptiness is form. And so that's called the profundity of the conventional. And so this is talking about what's called the subtle conventional nature of form. And of course form here means body, but of course we're saying the person, the body, the mind, in fact all phenomena are empty, and emptiness is form, is saying because things are empty, therefore in this case form or body can appear and functions and exists. Because things are empty, therefore the form, which is in this case here is the body, therefore body can arise, can appear and exists and functions. So what we see here is that form, or the body, is empty of independent existence because it is dependently existent. It's a dependent arising. And that's what this is saying here. So the reasoning is that everything is empty of inherent existence. So this is emptiness, of course. Because they are dependent arisings. So this is what emptiness's form is saying. The conventional nature of the body, but everything in general, is that it is a dependent arising. It arises dependently. So here, arising means coming into existence dependently. So this is the flip side of emptiness. So what do we mean that things are dependent arisings? There are three ways in which things exist dependently or come into existence dependently. The first is things exist depending on causes and conditions. For example, this laptop here exists depending on causes and conditions. One of the very first conditions necessary is someone who needs to think about designing this laptop. Then, of course, all the raw materials needed to be gathered, all the things, that raw material needed to be refined, all the various components needed to be manufactured, and then all those components needed to be assembled, and then of course all the factories and people involved in the process also necessary. So all of these causes and conditions were necessary for us to have this laptop here now. So I think this is fairly straightforward. Also, of course, things exist depending on their parts. Again, this laptop here exists depending on its parts. Without the metal frame, the screen, the keyboard, the battery, electronic components, without all these parts, there would be no laptop. So again, straightforward.
But what we're saying here is, because things are dependent, they are not independently existent. This is the reason.
Can you repeat that?
Because things are dependent is the reasoning to overturn the fact that things are independent. But probably most of us here are happy to accept that this laptop exists depending on causes and conditions in its parts, but at the same time, maybe we're happy to accept that when we walk in the door, there's already a laptop existing here on the table. True? Probably. But that should be impossible according to this logic. Why are we happy to accept those two things, which are actually contradictory? The reason is that we only understand these two ideas at a very superficial level. To understand them at a deeper level, we have to go to the third way in which things are dependent. And that is, things exist depending on labeling, designation, or conception. Those three words, of course, are saying the same thing. So if you understand one of those words, you understand all three. And when we look at that, we might think, okay, I know what that means. It means there's a thing here which we're calling a laptop. Again, that's a fairly superficial understanding. To understand this at a deeper level, what we can appreciate is that when we look out on the world around us, we are receiving a mass of sense data, particularly visual data. And we have to make some sense or meaning out of all of this stuff, otherwise we couldn't function. So what we do is we draw lines around various collections of data and we create objects. We create meaningful objects to make sense of all of this. We have to do this. If we don't do this, we couldn't function. But we do more than this because we live in a world with others. So on top of drawing lines and creating objects, we give names to those objects that we've created because we need to communicate with other people. So that's what this means. It's the process of drawing lines to create an object and then giving it the name. And we have to do this. But how we draw lines and create objects is not fixed. It's completely arbitrary depending on the meaning that we want to get out of what we see. For example, and maybe this is particularly relevant here in Israel, this is the example I always use. So, how many objects are there? We decide. I mean, probably most of the time, that data, you'll draw one line and create star. But maybe on another occasion, it's more meaningful to draw two lines and say there's two triangles there. Or on another occasion, we may draw 6 lines and say there's 6 triangles. Another time, maybe 7 lines, there's 6 triangles and a hexagon. Or we may just say there's a collection of 18 lines there. So how many objects are there? Is there 1, 2, 6, 7, 18? How many objects are there? We decide. There's no star to be found there from its own side. The only star that exists is the one in our conceptual framework. We create the star. There's no star to be found there in the basis. So what we see here, based on this,
we often see a couple of terms. One is that things are merely labelled. Merely, of course, means only, just, that things do not exist more than simply within our conceptual framework. And another term is things are not findable. Not findable means you cannot find the object in the basis. There is no star to be found there from its own side. The only star that exists is the one within our conceptual framework that we've created. Let's now go back to these two ideas based on this understanding. This is a timeline, this is a seed, and this is the plant that it produces. So we say that the plant exists depending on causes and conditions. So the underlying cause is the seed, and the conditions are the soil, sunlight, water, and so forth. Now we believe things exist independent of us. If that's the case, then it should be a fixed, obvious point at where the seed becomes the plant. So at what point in this process does the seed become the plant? We decide. The seed becomes the plant at the point where this configuration of data stops looking like our concept of seed and starts looking like our concept of plant. And we all have slightly different concepts of seeds and plants. So for some of us, the point might be already here. For some of us, it could be here, here, here. We decide when the plant comes into existence.
This is exactly the dispute about abortion.
Here's another point. Is we say that the plant, the seed and plant, are in a cause and effect relationship. And if two things are in a cause and effect relationship, by definition, they cannot exist at the same time. The question is here, does the seed stop existing before the plant comes into existence? So think about it. Does the seed stop existing before the plant comes into existence? There can only be two answers, yes or no. Which is it? If you say no, it means the seed is existing at the same time as the plant, which is illogical because they're in a cause and effect relationship. So no is illogical. If you say yes, the seed has ceased to exist, where is the plant coming from? Yes is illogical. Both no and yes are illogical. Why are they illogical? Because of our belief in independent existence. Our belief in independent existence makes common sense ideas like cause and effect illogical. They cannot function. Illogical. So Nagarjuna, in his classic text, the Mula Madhyamika Karika, the fundamental wisdom of middle way, which is based on this teachings like the Heart Sutra, he has all sorts of arguments like this in his classic work. He says, you believe in independent existence? What about cause and result? How does that work? How does agent and action work? Fire and fuel? How do all of these things work? None of them work. They become illogical. So he uses these sorts of arguments to undermine the fact or belief that things exist independently. One more point here. We say that the plant exists depending on causes and conditions. In other words, the result, the depends on the cause. But this view of emptiness is saying that the cause depends on the result as well. How does the cause depend on the result? And it's not because this plant produces more seeds. That's not the answer. Anyone?
Without the plant, the seed could not be the cause of the plant.
In what sense?
In the sense that if the seed has to function as a cause, there has to be a result.
Yes. You can only call something a cause if you have the idea result. You can only call something a seed if you have the idea plant. Whether or not it produces it is irrelevant. So cause only exists depending on result as well. Okay. Now we'll look at parts. And for this one, I use a different example, the old pen example. So we say that the pen exists depending on its parts, but can you find a pen here anywhere? Is there a pen to be found here? So we can investigate and see if we can find a pen. Is that a pen? No. Is this a pen? No. Is the piece of plastic on the end a pen? No. Is the metal tube a pen? No. Is the round ball on the end a pen? No. Is the ink inside a pen? No. And then people go, oh, that's easy. It's the collection of the parts is the pen. There we go. Oh, no. In a certain shape. Okay, you have to tell me when the pen comes into existence. Don't miss it. So what we realize is the pen comes into existence when this configuration of data closely enough resembles our concept of pen. And our concepts usually have at least two parts, appearance and functionality. When this appears closely enough to our idea of pen, and it seems to function according to our idea of pen, then there's a pen. We bring the pen into existence. There's no pen to be found here in the bases. Because if the pen exists in the bases, it would mean that if a caveman came in the door, they'd see pen and start writing with it. Maybe they would see some sort of weapon to stab with. And if a dog came in the door, maybe they'd see some sort of chewing stick. And then if a tiny ant came along here, they may see a home to live in. So is this a home, a chewing stick, a weapon, or a pen? From its own side, none of those things. From the side of the observer, all of those things. So we bring the pen into existence. There's no pen to be found here in the basis. And we say that the pen exists depending on the parts, i.e. the whole depends on the parts. But just like cause depends on result, part depends on whole. Because you can only call something a part of a pen if you have the idea pen. So part depends on whole as well.
What does it say about me?
One more point and then some questions. So, correctly, what we're doing here is we're drawing a line, creating a single object, and we are giving it the name pen. So what we're doing is we are applying the label pen to the basis. But the problem begins with our language. Because we often say, this is a pen. And that way of speaking reinforces grasping. Because here we have the basis, which is constantly changing. No? Label pen, does that change? No. Pen is static. We're applying the label to the basis, which is good, but then when we say this is a pen, we have fused the label to the basis.
the label is not the basis. The label is applied to the basis. We forget that. This is a pen. And then suddenly, this becomes a static object, because pen is static, but this is not. So this is, this ignorance, is this fusing the label to the basis and saying there is a pen there to be found from its own side. So, correctly, pen is something merely labelled depending on its parts, versus what we normally instinctively feel is the pen is the collection of the parts. So if we can understand those two statements are not saying the same thing, we're beginning to understand something about emptiness. So the two statements are, the pen is the collection of the parts, versus the pen is merely labelled depending on the collection of the parts. Okay, maybe a few questions now.
Okay, with the pen it's easy to understand. Once you refer to persons, which is a thinking creature, then come more questions. So what is exactly the label of me? Or is this what the label my parents created? The label was developed during my education?
Well, from a Buddhist perspective, we instinctively have this, even at birth, that we instinctively grasp onto a sense of me. Whether we can articulate it through language, not relevant, really. So even a dog or other animals have a sense of me. They don't use language in an intellectual way that we do, but they have this sense of me, of person. So that is instinctive. And of course that instinctive sense of me is on the basis of the body and the mind. So just like correctly, pen is labelled on its parts, correctly, me that exists is a me labelled on the body and the mind. And we have to do that, otherwise we couldn't function. The problem is, what do? This is me. I am the body and the mind. Is the same as saying the pen is the parts. Me is, the label me is applied to the basis of the body and the mind. That is the me that exists. That is the me that exists as something merely labelled, not findable. Now here's the difficult point. Going back to the two extremes, we're stuck in these two, we see there's only two possibilities. Either there is an independent me, an independent world, or there's no me. So once we start going down the road of emptiness, we flip to the other extreme. And so often then when we start to investigate in emptiness, then we end up in the extreme of nihilism. And sometimes I hear people who say they're Buddhists and who've apparently been studying Buddhism and practicing for quite some time, still they say, oh, it doesn't matter because everything's empty. I mean, this is completely nihilism. This is a complete wrong understanding of emptiness. But these are people who've apparently studied and practiced for many years, and they still say, oh, it doesn't matter because everything's empty. In fact, the correct is, because things are empty, everything matters. That is the correct understanding. Because things function, they must be empty. Because they're empty, they can function. Because if this pen existed independently, if it had an inherent nature of being a pen from its own side, you couldn't change. You couldn't create it, you couldn't destroy it, it couldn't function. But because it has no unique nature of being a pen from its own side, therefore you can create it can function, and you can destroy it. That's the correct understanding. That is a measure of finding the middle way. The measure is understanding that because things function, they must be empty of independent existence, and because they're empty of independent existence, they can function. That is the middle way path. Here. Not so easy.
You can apply the same logic to the assembly of the parts as well. So then...
there's no bottom. You go down, down, down.
How can you label something that is possibility.
But remember, merely labelled means things exist. That is the measure of existence. And here's an interesting point. Back here. We say that the star is merely labelled. Or another way, they often use the word designated. So we say the star is the designation, and this is the basis of designation. Basis of designation only comes into existence at the same time as the designation. Because you can't, how can you have basis of designation without designation? It's irrational.
I asked you on the break if matter can be independent, and you say no, and now you're talking about a base. So
But the base depends on the designation. You can only have basis of designation if you have designation. You can only have part of pen if there's pen. No? If you say basis of designation without designation, what does that mean? It has no meaning.
Before you gave like 4 different examples of different sentient beings that see the same object different. The ant sees. So there is something that they both all see. It's not what can they, how can you label something that there isn't there? Something needs to be there in order for you to put label on it.
Okay. This was coming next session, but I'll give you a brief answer now. In every experience, there's single experience. Okay? Experience is singular. Within experience, there are 2 aspects: experiencer and experienced. Is there before an experiencer that then creates the experienced? No. So, in experience, one of the very first lines that we draw usually is we draw a line here. We create experiencer. And then at the same time, then we have experienced.
You also need an object to experience. Or either, if not, you will
But the
experience
object comes into existence at the same time as the experiencer.
as a pen.
As a what?
As a pen, or as another example you gave before.
But we can go down, down, down.
The basics itself also.
Yeah, but this pen is made up of atoms. And a pen is a label we're applying to this collection of atoms. An atom is a label we're applying to subatomic particles. Subatomic particles is a label we're applying. We can go down, down, down forever. Because as soon as we think we hit a bottom, then that would apply all the way up. You can't have something at some level being independent and then something above it is not.
Sometimes, okay, maybe I don't understand. In this chain, you will get some point that you can't put label on something that does not exist. Something very minimum, maybe only matter, if not function at all.
We're still stuck here.
Independent.
We're still stuck here.
Probably.
Yeah, I mean, this way of speaking is that we demand something is here to have something exist.
No, I'm saying that if you want to have parts and label something, you need something to
A
label.
basis, yeah, exactly. But then the basis has parts and we keep going forever.
Essentially,
Because if you logically speaking, if you go to a point you say, well, that is not, then the same applies all the way up. Then everything's independent all the way up. No? That's the logic. Depending on what level you go down to, let's say we go down to subatomic particles and we